Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher, Maeve O'Rourke, Donal, the ledger Byrne, on Steel Eyes Flannery, and Fiachra Doyle, 5 names that ruled Dublin's criminal underworld, each with their own deadly skill, each hiding secrets that would ignite betrayal, disappearances, and a gangland collapse no one saw coming. Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher, was not the kind of man anyone noticed at first glance. Average height, quiet voice, and a habit of wearing plain clothes that could blend into any Dublin crowd. Yet behind that ordinary mask, he was building something extraordinary, a criminal network that would spread far beyond the city's borders. His story began in the narrow lanes of the north inner city, where poverty and opportunity often went hand in hand. In his early 20s, Ciarán started moving stolen electronics phones, laptops, and televisions through backstreet markets. He wasn't flashy like other street hustlers. He let others brag about their earnings while he kept his head down, slowly building relationships with men who had more power than he did. The turning point came when he brokered a deal between 2 rival groups who had been at each other's throats for months. He offered both sides a share in a shipment of smuggled cigarettes, ensuring no one lost face and everyone made money. That deal marked the birth of his reputation as a man who could make problems disappear not just by force, but through strategy. He became known as someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of Dublin's underworld without making unnecessary enemies. By 2014, Ciarán's network had grown from petty theft to a sophisticated operation handling drugs, weapons, and extortion. He rarely attended meetings in person, and when he did, he spoke little, preferring to let his presence speak for him. His most unsettling trait was his ability to vanish. Weeks, sometimes months, would pass without anyone seeing him. Then, just when rumors began to swirl that he was dead or in hiding, he would appear in a pub, unannounced, smiling faintly as if nothing had happened. People called him the Ghost because he could be everywhere and nowhere at once. Police. Surveillance teams tried to follow him, but always ended up losing their target. One moment, he'd be spotted entering a building in the Liberties district. The next, he'd vanish without any sign of departure. Some believed he had multiple safe houses scattered around Dublin. Others claimed he traveled to Spain and Germany. During his disappearances, meeting with suppliers and laundering money through offshore accounts, there were whispers about connections in Eastern Europe, and rumors that he had struck deals with ex-military members who still had access to weapons caches from decades past. The Ghost didn't just survive in Dublin's criminal world, he dominated it through patience and calculation. While other gang leaders flaunted their wealth in expensive cars and flashy jewelry, Ciarán kept his life deliberately understated. He drove a modest car, lived in an unremarkable apartment block, and never used social media. His wealth was hidden in assets under other people's names, businesses that seemed legitimate on paper but were quietly funneling cash into his empire. Territorial disputes in the city were often bloody, but Ciarán avoided open warfare whenever possible. Instead, he would dismantle rivals from the inside. He would find a weak link, someone in debt, someone with a drug habit, someone desperate for money, and offer them a way out in exchange for loyalty. Within months, his enemy's operations would crumble without a single shot fired. This method earned him both respect and fear. It was one thing to fight a rival you could see. It was another to be dismantled by someone you couldn't even find. His closest associates understood that the Ghost valued loyalty above all else. Those who stayed true to him were rewarded with steady income, protection, and the feeling of being part of something untouchable. Those who betrayed him were erased from the streets, their disappearances never explained, their names whispered only in cautionary tales. By the time law enforcement realized the scale of his operation, Ciarán's reach extended far beyond Dublin. He had contacts in Belfast, Cork, and Limerick, as well as international smuggling routes that moved cocaine from South America through Spain and into Ireland. Yet no one could prove anything. Every time police tried to connect him to a crime, the trail went cold. Witnesses refused to talk. Evidence vanished. Paperwork was lost in unexplained administrative errors. The Ghost had become a figure of myth among younger criminals. They looked up to him not for his violence, but for his ability to survive and thrive in a world where so many ended up dead or in prison. Older gang members, however, saw him as something more dangerous, a man who had turned invisibility into a weapon, a predator who hunted not with bullets but with patience. Dublin's streets were changing, and everyone knew it. Behind the closed doors of bars and safe houses, other gang leaders discussed ways to curb his influence, but they all faced the same problem. How do you strike at someone you can't find? The ghost was already moving pieces on the board, setting traps that no one would see until it was too late. And somewhere in the shadows of the city he controlled, Ciarán Kelleher was watching, waiting, and planning his next move. Maeve O'Rourke was the kind of figure who left a mark on every street she touched. Her reputation was not built on quiet deals or shadowy disappearances like Ciarán's, but on a raw, unpredictable presence that made even the toughest criminals think twice before crossing her. She had grown up in one of Dublin's roughest estates, a place where respect was earned, not through charm or words, but through action. By her late teens, she was already known for her fearlessness in fights, taking on men twice her size without hesitation. Violence wasn't something she sought for sport, it was simply a language she understood better than most. When Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher, noticed her, she was working as muscle for a smaller crew that was struggling to keep its territory. Maeve stood out immediately, not just for her strength, but for her loyalty. Once she gave her word, she followed through, no matter the cost. The ghost saw in her a perfect enforcer, someone who could be his visible edge while he stayed hidden. In the shadows, she became his public face, the one people dealt with when they needed to understand exactly who they were dealing with. Maeve quickly developed her own style of control. She didn't just intimidate people, she kept them guessing. One week, she might stroll into a pub, laughing, buying drinks for strangers, and handing out cash to locals. The next, she might show up in the same spot, silent and cold, fixing her gaze on someone until they broke under the pressure. This unpredictability was her weapon. People never knew which version of Maeve they were going to meet, and that uncertainty made her dangerous. She was deeply loyal to Ciarán, but her methods were entirely her own. When a debt needed collecting, Maeve would appear without warning, sometimes in broad daylight, standing outside someone's workplace until they got the message. Other times, she would send a quiet signal, a phone left ringing twice, with no answer, a single bullet casing in a letterbox. She believed fear worked best when it was layered, when people could feel it building before anything happened. Over the years, Maeve cultivated a network of informants who operated out of fear, respect, or a mix of both. Shopkeepers, taxi drivers, even pub owners, many knew better than to say no when Maeve came asking for information. If a rival gang was making moves, Maeve would know within hours. If someone had been seen speaking to police, she would know. By the next morning, her reach was such that in certain neighborhoods, nothing moved without her approval. The police made multiple attempts to charge her with assault, intimidation, and racketeering. But witnesses rarely followed through. Some backed out after receiving subtle threats, so others packed up and left the city entirely. In a few cases, people vanished altogether, their names turning into quiet warnings told over drinks late at night. Maeve was careful, but she was not untouchable. Rival crews saw her as the wall between them and the ghost, and some were bold enough to try breaking it down. In one incident, a group of young dealers attempted to corner her in a car park, hoping to send a message to Ciarán. What they hadn't counted on was Maeve's skill in reading people. She had sensed something was off that night, arriving with backup hidden nearby. The confrontation ended in seconds, leaving 2 men in hospital and the rest scattering into the night. Word spread. Quickly, Maeve wasn't just dangerous because of her violence. She was dangerous because she saw trouble coming before it arrived. Her loyalty to the ghost was matched only by her distrust of outsiders. She had no patience for those who talked too much, and she made it clear that loose lips could sink more than just ships. Inside the gang, Maeve was both respected and feared, a strange mix that ensured few dared to cross her. Even those close to her could never fully predict what she would do next. By the time she was in her early 30s, Maeve O'Rourke was not just an enforcer, she was a name in her own right. Parents in certain districts told their children not to get on the wrong side of her. Rival gang leaders factored her into every decision they made about territory. For Ciarán, Maeve was more than a right-hand. She was the visible storm that kept his enemies distracted, while he remained the unseen force behind it all, and in the streets of Dublin. Storms had a way of clearing the weak and leaving only the strongest standing. Maeve thrived in that chaos, knowing every move she made echoed far beyond the moment. She didn't just protect the ghost's empire, she expanded it. One calculated act of fear at a time. Donal, the ledger Byrne, was not the kind of man anyone expected to find in the middle of a criminal empire. He didn't look the part. No tattoos, no scars, no broken knuckles from street fights. He wore pressed shirts, neat trousers, and glasses that gave him the air of a quiet office clerk. In a way, that was exactly what he was, except his office was the hidden financial heart of Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher's entire operation. Donal didn't need to carry a gun. His weapon was knowledge, and he wielded it with precision. He had once been a respected bank clerk, the kind who never made mistakes in his ledgers. But his habit of noticing patterns others overlooked led him to discover a series of suspicious transactions linked to a construction firm. Instead of reporting it, he saw an opportunity. That choice pulled him into a world where numbers could be worth more than bullets. Within a few years, he left the bank, bringing with him a rare understanding of how money could move invisibly through legitimate channels without raising alarms. When the ghost heard about Donal, he didn't hesitate. Ciarán knew power wasn't just about controlling the streets, it was about controlling the flow of cash. Donal became the architect of that system, created a network of shell companies, fake charities, and offshore accounts that allowed millions to disappear into safe places while still appearing to be part of legitimate business activity. His genius lay in making every euro seem clean. Even if it had been soaked in crime, Donal moved the gang's money through high-end art sales, fake property developments, and carefully staged loans between companies that didn't really exist. He studied Ireland's tax codes and banking regulations until he knew exactly where the loopholes were, slipping the gang's earnings through them like water through cracks. International agencies might have spotted unusual movements, but Donal made sure the paper trail led to nowhere: a dead company in the Cayman Islands, a trust fund linked to a fake heir in Monaco, a luxury car purchased in one name and sold in another within hours. He was cautious, but he was also ambitious. Unlike Maeve, who thrived in confrontation, Donal preferred to be unseen. His quiet demeanor made him easy to underestimate, but he was always calculating his next move. He served the ghost faithfully. He also ensured that some of the gang's hidden wealth was tucked away under his own private control. To Donal, loyalty was important, but survival was more so. The police found him even harder to pin down than Ciarán. Financial crimes required proof, and proof required witnesses or documents, both of which Donal was skilled at making vanish. In one instance, a forensic accountant working with law enforcement came close to mapping out the gang's laundering system. The man's office was later found ransacked, the hard drives missing, and the case was quietly dropped. No one could prove Donal had anything to do with it, but in the underworld, no one doubted it. Donal rarely interacted with the street-level side of the business. He didn't care about turf wars, drug shipments, or who owed money to whom. Focus was keeping the river of money flowing steadily, never attracting enough attention to cause panic. If someone threatened that flow, Donal didn't send enforcers, he destroyed them financially. He could freeze an enemy's accounts through manipulated bank procedures, bury them under fabricated debts, or ensure that tax authorities suddenly came knocking with questions they couldn't answer. Still, Donal understood that his position was fragile. He wasn't feared in the way Maeve was, and he wasn't untouchable like the ghost. He was valuable only as long as he was useful. That awareness pushed him to ensure he was indispensable. No one in the gang knew the full structure of the financial system except Donal. If something happened to him, large portions of the Empire's money would be trapped in places no one could access without the passwords, documents, and account codes locked away in his private vaults. Behind his careful, calm exterior, Donal was making quiet moves that no one noticed. Small sums, insignificant on their own, were being siphoned into accounts that didn't belong to the ghost. They were for Donal's escape fund, a lifeline in case the empire collapsed or turned on him. He knew that in Dublin's underworld, alliances could shift overnight. When that day came, Donal the Ledger Byrne intended to walk away, not just alive, but rich. For now, he remained in place, his hands invisible in the daily violence of the gang's work, yet holding the strings that made it all possible. As long as the money kept flowing, the ghost trusted him. But beneath that trust was a silent truth. Donal was playing a long game, and no one else knew the rules. Why? On Steel Eyes, Flannery had a reputation that stretched far beyond Dublin's gangland. In a world full of men who relied on intimidation and noise, Eoghan was silent and deliberate. His nickname came from the way he looked at people, steady, unblinking, and without a trace of emotion. That stare alone was enough to unsettle even hardened criminals. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his words were short, sharp, and final. He was the one you called when you needed something done quickly and cleanly, without any loose ends. Eoghan's early years were spent in the back streets of Finglas, where he learned to survive by staying quiet and watching everything. He was never the loudest in the room, but he was always the most dangerous. By his 20s, he was already working as a freelance enforcer, taking jobs from anyone who could pay. Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher, saw him in action during a dispute involving a rival crew in the Liberties. Eoghan didn't just deal with the threat, he dismantled it with precision, taking out the key players without drawing police attention. The ghost knew immediately that Steel Eyes belonged in his circle. Once he joined the Empire, Eoghan became the man for the hardest jobs. He was used for situations where fear alone wouldn't work, where someone had to be removed from the picture entirely. He planned his hits like a craftsman, studying routines, weaknesses, and escape routes until the job was as close to risk-free as possible. The ghost valued him because he never acted recklessly. Violence was a tool, not a habit. For years, Eoghan worked without a single mistake that could be traced back to him. He had an unbroken record, which in the underworld was almost unheard of. That changed one night in late 2019. The target was a mid-level drug dealer named Brendan Lacey, who had been moving product into one of Ciarán's territories without permission. The job was supposed to be simple: track him, wait for him to leave his local bar, and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Eoghan had done it dozens of times before, but something was off from the start. Brendan was unusually cautious that night, changing his usual route home and stopping at unfamiliar places. Eoghan followed at a distance, still confident he could close the job. When Brendan finally headed toward a dark side street, Eoghan moved in. That's when the trap was sprung. Two men stepped out from the shadows behind him, and another blocked the exit ahead. The air erupted with the sound of gunfire. Eoghan reacted instantly, diving for cover and returning fire. One of the attackers dropped, another was wounded, and the rest scattered. But not before one bullet found its mark, slamming into Eoghan's lower back. The pain was like nothing he'd ever felt, and though he managed to escape, he knew that injury would change everything. The bullet lodged dangerously close to his spine, and doctors told him surgery carried too much risk. From that day, pain became his constant companion. He moved slower, thought longer before accepting work, and started noticing something he'd never felt before: hesitation. That hesitation was deadly in his line of work. As he recovered, rumors began to circulate. Some said the ambush had been set up by Brendan's crew. Others whispered something more dangerous, that Eoghan had been targeted from within his own gang. The most dangerous rumor of all claimed that Eoghan had started talking to police, trading information in exchange for protection. Maeve O'Rourke dismissed it as paranoia, but Ciarán's reaction was different. The ghost disappeared for 2 weeks without explanation. When he returned, Eoghan was gone. His apartment was stripped of anything personal. The bank account he used for expenses was untouched, and no one had seen or heard from him. Some said he had fled Ireland to escape, whoever had set him up. Others believed the ghost had quietly dealt with him to prevent any chance of betrayal. But in the months that followed, There were strange sightings. Men swore they saw steel eyes in crowded train stations, or walking down side streets at night, vanishing before they could call out. Whether Eoghan was alive or dead, no one could be sure. But for those who had known him, one thing was certain: his steel eyes was still out there. He wouldn't stay in the shadows forever. He would be watching, waiting for the moment to strike back at whoever had put him in the crosshairs. And when that day came, there would be no second chances. Fiachra Doyle had always been the smallest figure in Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher's circle, both in reputation and in the jobs he was trusted with. For years, his role had been limited. 2. Delivering packages, collecting small debts, and acting as a lookout when bigger deals went down. He was eager, loyal to whoever was in front of him, and desperate to be noticed. That desperation was exactly what made him useful to Donal the ledger. Byrne. Donal saw something in Fiachra that others overlooked. Not intelligence, but hunger. Hunger could be shaped. Hunger could be manipulated. And Donal had his own reasons for wanting to see cracks form in the ghost's empire, quietly, without anyone's knowledge. He began feeding Fiachra bits of information, small details about warehouse locations, shipment schedules, and which members of the gang were vulnerable. Donal dressed it up as giving the kid a chance to prove himself, but in truth, he was planting seeds for something far more dangerous. Fiachra started to imagine himself as more than just a runner. He began meeting with men outside the gang, small-time operators looking to move up in Dublin's criminal hierarchy. Together, they formed a loose plan to take over one of the ghost's main drug storage facilities. If they could seize the warehouse and its contents, they could either sell the product themselves or use it as leverage to negotiate their way into bigger business. Fiachra convinced himself that he wasn't betraying the ghost, just stepping out from under his shadow. The night they made their move was cold and wet, the streets slick with rain. Fiachra's crew arrived in 2 stolen vans, cutting the lights before rolling up to the warehouse. Donal's information had been precise: the security would be light, the guards few. For the first few minutes, it looked like everything was going exactly as planned. They overpowered the men on duty, forced open the loading bay doors, and began hauling crates into the vans. But Donal hadn't told Fiachra everything. He hadn't mentioned that Maeve O'Rourke had decided on a whim to stop by the warehouse. That night, she arrived just as the last crate was being loaded. What followed was chaos. Maeve didn't hesitate. She drew her weapon and opened fire. Fiachra's men scattered, returning shots as they dove for cover. The gunfight was short but brutal. When it was over, 3 of Fiachra's crew lay dead on the wet concrete. 2 more were wounded, and the rest were fleeing into the dark. Fiachra himself was tackled by Maeve before he could get to a van. She slammed him to the ground, gun pressed to his head, and for a moment he thought she was going to end him right there. But instead, she left him alive for the police, who arrived minutes later after someone likely Donal had tipped them off. In the interrogation room, faced with the choice of a long prison sentence or cooperation, Fiachra broke. At first, he gave up small names, low-level members. But once the officers realized he was willing to talk, they pushed harder, and he began spilling everything: routes, safe houses where weapons were stored, even some of the offshore fronts Donal had described to him. In a matter of days, law enforcement executed a series of raids that tore through the ghost's network. Ciarán vanished before they could get close. Maeve disappeared into the countryside, leaving no trail. Donal, unsurprisingly, was nowhere to be found as private. Accounts now swollen with the money he'd been quietly siphoning for years. The empire that had once dominated Dublin's underworld was in ruins, scattered to the wind by a mix of betrayal, ambition, and careful planning. From his cell, Fiachra began to hear stories. The ghost had been spotted in Spain, then in Germany, then back in Dublin, moving unseen as always. Some said he had a list, and at the top of that list was the name of the man who had talked. Others claimed the ghost was finished, content to live quietly off his hidden fortune. But Fiachra couldn't shake the feeling. The man who had once built an empire from the shadows wasn't done. Every time the prison gates clanged shut behind him at night, he imagined a figure standing in the dark outside, silent and patient. And he knew that if Ciarán, the ghost Kelleher, ever came for him, there would be no warning, no sound, only the cold certainty that the debt was finally being collected.